This is Tuesday, October 7th, 2025. We are in Natick, Massachusetts, and this tape is part of the Morse Institute Library's continuing Veterans Oral History Project. My name is Maureen Sullivan, and we are privileged to have with us today Ric Erickson. Welcome, Ric.
Thank you, Maureen.
May I ask when you were born?
I was born on January 23rd, 1942.
And where were you born?
I was born in Manhattan, New York.
And what community do you currently live in?
Natick.
Your marital status.
I'm single now.
And do you have children?
I do. 2 boys.
Grandchildren?
4.
All right. So tell us a little bit more about growing up in New York City.
Well, it was an adventure from start to finish. I was born right after the beginning of World War II. My dad was German, and shortly after I was born, he was rounded up with all the others of German who were first-generation Germans, and sent to a camp. So I grew up early on under the care of my mother with my older brother Bill, and she enrolled me in a Catholic school across the street from Columbia University. It was a wonderful experience, mostly because the student body was made up of children of graduate students at Columbia or Barnard. And so I had every day the experience of rubbing shoulders with Californians, Alabamans, Mainers, or maniacs, as we used to call them. And I did the usual things as a student there at the school. I sang in the choir. And one of my classmates, his father was in charge of the Metropolitan Opera and was looking for students my age that could join the children's chorus for various operas. And I auditioned for him, and he took me on, and so for about a year and a half, I sang at the Opera House whenever they had an opera like Carmen that required a children's chorus. And for the privilege, they paid me $5, which was a fortune in those days. I also had the opportunity to study at Juilliard School of Music, which was about 2 blocks from my house. And there, a young fellow by the name of Gates Ray was challenged to take a youngster off the street who had never played the piano and teach him how to play. And the graduation exercise consisted of me playing Clair de Lune. The air was full of tension, mostly on my part, but I'm sure he was feeling some of it also. We left New York when I was about 13, and we moved to Ohio up on the lake. And did I cover your question? Or would you like me to continue with Ohio?
Why don't you carry on with Ohio, but before that, when was your father released from camp?
He was released right after the war. They released everybody. When he was a youngster, he was a farm boy living outside Hamburg in a town of Altoona. Mm-hmm. And the Kaiser's troops were sent out to recruit youngsters his age. Their problem, though, was their uniform consisted of a helmet with a spike on the top, and you could see them coming from a mile away. So the kids always hid amongst the haystacks, etc. When he thought his luck might run out, he went down to the harbor at Hamburg and signed on as a able seaman on a ship that was coincidentally coming to New York. And when he got off the ship, he decided that he didn't want to go back to Germany and the problems there. And so he hired on the fella who was hiring everybody sitting around the fountain there in Greenwich Square. And off to Vermont he went until eventually the government caught up with him. He had come in under the radar, not through Ellis Island. Yeah. In Ohio, my brother and I, he was only 3 years older, a little over 3 years older than I. He and I went to a Catholic high school there, St. Edward, and joined the Tune Times, which was a variety show put on every year. We both enjoyed singing. He had sung with me in a choir there at Corpus Christi in New York. And when we went to college, he went to John Carroll University. It's a Jesuit school like Boston College. And he said, this place is just terrific. And so I followed him. And we were both in the Glee Club, which was great because it gave us a chance to travel and sing with women's choruses in colleges around the country. So all in all, that was a good experience. But the important thing for me there, although I should add that I worked the entire time. I didn't stay on campus. Between my mother and I and my brother, we cobbled together enough to pay the tuition. But I had to work every day. But one thing I had, besides the Glee Club, was Army ROTC. And Army ROTC opened up vistas for me. I could see a career in front of me that might be worth taking a chance on. And so I worked very hard to become a distinguished military graduate, which was an honor, yes, but it gave me the opportunity to choose my branch of service. My branch at John Carroll University was transportation, and that's virtually where everybody was commissioned. But the DMG was allowed to pick armor, artillery, or infantry. Before it came to that point, there was a young fellow from Tulane who joined me in the junior year of ROTC down at Fort Story, which is right next to Virginia Beach, and we're sitting up at the top of the bleachers there and saying, do we really want transportation to be our career? And we both agreed we didn't. So we spent that entire 2 hours not so much listening to the instructor as trying to figure out where we wanted to go and we both decided on artillery. But we took very different career paths. When he graduated from Tulane, he went into field artillery. When I graduated from John Carroll, I went into air defense artillery. The two of them were all combined in the artillery branch, but you never knew which of the two parts you were going to join. And so that's my time in Ohio.
Okay, so you graduated in May
1963.
May, okay, 63, and a couple of months after that, you're a second lieutenant now, correct?
Yes.
And you hit on Fort Banks?
Fort Banks, it doesn't exist anymore. It closed in 1966.
Okay.
3 years after I reported there. It's in Winthrop, Massachusetts.
All right.
Right inside of the airport. So this area was my very first assignment. I didn't stay there long. They gave me enough time to get organized and sent me off to jump school.
Jump school.
Yes, down at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Okay.
That was a great experience. that was right after. I'm sorry, I got a little mixed up there on my sequence. After Fort Banks, I went to the basic course,
Okay.
officer basic course,
And that was at,
and that was at Fort Bliss, Texas.
okay.
And it was right after that. Out of that school, I went to airborne school at Fort Benning, and I was only there a few weeks. It's a very short course. They ask you to jump 5 times, and if you're successful and don't break a leg, you're given a parachutist badge. We had terrible weather. It was the winter, and we were the last class before Christmas. All the sergeants there wanted us gone so they could go home for Christmas. And so we did some jumps in some horrible weather. But all in all, it was an experience I very much enjoyed.
Now, you were in Fort Benning in November of '63. We all know what happened during that time when President Kennedy was assassinated. Can you tell me your personal recollections?
Frankly, I don't have a good recollection of that. I watched the video of the assassination. I was so sorry because I thought he was a man of good character and had done some dumb things like the Bay of Pigs. And had gotten us kind of involved in Vietnam. But he had done so much good otherwise that I thought he was a real loss, and I was sorry it happened. About that time, I was asked to go up to Syracuse, New York. And in Syracuse, I joined NORAD as an air defense officer. It was interesting because I was working with the Air Force and also with Canadians. And so that was quite an experience. I was there about 6 months, and I returned to Ohio to marry Marcy. And we returned to Syracuse. Adam, Rich, my oldest son, was born in Syracuse University Hospital.
Okay.
And about 6 months later, we left Hancock Field, and I returned Marcy and my new baby boy to Lakewood, Ohio, so they'd be near family. And I prepared to leave for an assignment in Alaska with the Air Defense Artillery again, all part of NORAD, North American Air Defense, and its intent was to use the radars stretched across Alaska to detect incoming aircraft and missiles and prepare our defenses accordingly.
Now, according to your list, you were stationed at Fire Island. Where is that in Alaska?
Fire Island is in the bay outside Anchorage.
Okay.
You could see the hilarity maybe in Anchorage, but you couldn't quite hear the music. We were a few miles off the coast. It was a good assignment. The FAA was out there with us and used our radar as well. Again, I was working with Air Force. No Canadians this time.
Okay, so it looks like you were there for just about 7 months until you returned to Ohio.
Actually, yeah, peculiar thing. About halfway through the assignment, I got a call from the Red Cross. And they said, "We'd like you to return to Ohio, please, on the first available transport." And my wife was having our second son, Adam, and she was in trouble. My boss, a young major by the name of Nels Leggett, arranged for a helicopter to pick me up. He said, "I'll give you 15 minutes to pack, And he had a helicopter on a pad waiting for me, and had phoned ahead to the Air Force to hold any aircraft they had going to the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did. They held an aircraft on a tarmac for me to get over there with the helicopter. And so roughly a half hour after I got the call from the Red Cross, I was on my way east.
Wow.
The wonderful thing about this, and I didn't learn until I read his memoir years later, he was due to go that next weekend to a family reunion. And he gave that up because he and I could not both be gone at the same time. And I'm forever grateful to him for that. I wish I would have known at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But, I returned from Ohio and finished out my tour at Fire Island.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, where did I go next? Yes, I had to go to the advanced course down at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. By that time, I was a captain,
Mm-hmm.
and the course was in two parts. The first part at Fort Sill was field artillery, and the second part was at Fort Bliss again, air defense artillery. And half the class was one and half the class had assignments in the other, but not a mixture. And we looked at one another and we said, how in the world are we going to do this? We had no experience. Some had 3 years experience with one side of the artillery, and the rest of us. Well, the Army came to the same conclusion. They had done a field artillery study, an artillery study in 1968. Mm-hmm. And the Army accepted their conclusion that the two skill sets for air defense artillery and field artillery were so dissimilar, it would be better to split them. I returned from that advanced course, and it was kind of a holding assignment. I was commander of a training battery, which had the responsibility of training enlisted people, in my case, fire direction, which is kind of complicated. But I only had a chance to stay there for, it was a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. And my commander came up to me when I was watching a softball game. My wife was with me, and he said, I've got some news. He said, you have to leave next month. You're headed to Vietnam. And so I took my wife and my two children back to Ohio, settled them in near their family, and off I went to Vietnam.
All right, and you were stationed at Camp Carroll. Where in Vietnam was that?
It was about as far north in Vietnam as you could get. I was assigned to an artillery unit, which consisted of 175 millimeter gun or an 8-inch howitzer. I say or because the same chassis could hold both kinds of barrels, and all you had to do was spin off the barrel from a 175 and refit it with an 8-inch, and that's what you had. The difference between the two weapons was that the 8-inch was very, very accurate. However, it could only fire between 10 and 15 miles, depending on the charge you put in with it. The 175 gun could fire 21 miles. And I discovered early on that the 175 gun was the reason we were there. Mm-hmm. We were on a hilltop. I could almost see North Vietnam across the Ben Hai River. But the reason we were there was to support the Marines at Quai Son. We were the only artillery that could range that far. My fellow Fire Direction Center colleague was an MIT graduate And he didn't like the firing tables for the 175. He says, we can do better than this. And he made up a whole set of firing tables for the 175, and we used them for the rest, because with those new tables, we could put a round right in the wire surrounding caisson. And it saved the Marines many, many times. For the 8-inch howitzer, where we needed pinpoint accuracy, we supported the long-range patrols, the LURPs, who were out there looking for the enemy. And they would often find them and call in fire. And you had to be right on target. And that's what the 8-inch howitzers were good for. And again, the skill sets, as I mentioned earlier, were very different for air defense and field artillery. And after the decision was made, they had to, or they decided to, query everybody in the artillery and ask which side of the house they would like to be in. And I had decided, since I had command of a battery in combat, that I'd like to be in the field artillery, thank you very much. And they agreed with me. And so I was now a field artilleryman and not an air defense artilleryman. I had also gotten there right about Tet, which was a terrible time for the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong came across in numbers and wreaked havoc all through South Vietnam. It was a hard time for everybody. I left there in '69. I hadn't taken an R&R, and my commander said, I don't want anybody to know that I had an officer who I did not give an opportunity to take an R&R, and I was only there for another month. And he said, you're taking one. And so I took one to Tokyo. And we landed in Tokyo. I was there supposedly for 2 weeks. And I was doing the touristy thing in Tokyo. And I was down at the Ginza, and I had a seizure. And I guess they carted me off to the hospital and said, you had a seizure. You can't stay here, but we've called the Army, and they're coming to get you. And so they came down from Camp Zama, picked me up, brought me back to the clinic there, and proceeded to figure out why I had had a seizure. And they said, we suspect that it's an early indication of Agent Orange. And sure enough, that's where we were, in the northern part of South Vietnam, where a lot of Viet Cong were moving, and so they used a lot of Agent Orange. The B-52s were over us all the time. So they suspected that's what set it off. And what they found, though, was that they could induce it. And they could induce it with strobe lights. And so they proceeded to do that. They concluded that they didn't really know where it had come from, and I was pretty convinced it was Agent Orange. But at any rate, they put me on medication, and I've not had a seizure since. Yeah, and I'm still on it. The reason I'm on it is because if you have a seizure in the state of New Hampshire, where I came from, they took your license for a year, and I couldn't afford to be doing that. So I was very, very careful about medication. When they released me from Camp Zama, I came back to the United States to collect the family.
Yep.
The Army decided a perfect assignment for me would be teaching. And I thought for sure I was headed back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to teach field artillery subjects. And they said, no, we've got a better idea. Your brother is teaching at the transportation school in Virginia. How would you like to go back there? I said, what, teaching transportation subjects? He said, no, combat arms. And so I did that for a couple of years. It was good because this was the first time the cousins got to meet each other. My brother had been overseas in Europe and Turkey, and I had gone the other direction. And finally, we were at the same place, and the cousins got to know each other. He had 7 kids. I had 3. And so that was a great thing.
Just to elaborate for a moment, when you said you were an instructor in combat arms, what kind of arms were you teaching? Pistols, machine guns, what have you?
That's a term of art to refer to infantry, artillery, and armor. They're referred to as the combat arms.
Mm-hmm.
My subject was to teach nuclear weapons. And what does nuclear weapons have to do with transportation? Well, what I was teaching them was to how to lead their units and prepare their positions in such a way that they could survive in a nuclear situation. I think my third son was born there at Fort Eustis, Mark, in 1970. And while I was there, I took advantage of the fact that I didn't have any work to do in the evenings. And I took a master's at the College of William and Mary up in Williamsburg, which is just 10 miles up the road. So from that standpoint, it was a pretty darn good assignment, yeah. But the Army had other ideas for me. They said, you've had enough fun teaching. We want you to be the personnel psychologist at USAREC, the U.S. Army Recruiting Command, located just down the road in Hampton. And I said, what does a personnel psychologist do? Well, first of all, you're not working for the Army, you're working for the Department of Defense. And the subject troops that you're interested in are Air Force, Navy, and Army. And my responsibility was to do 1/3 of the evaluation of everybody coming into the service. And that was the mental evaluation. I had colleagues in the office who were responsible for the medical evaluation, and there were a couple of other youngsters there who looked into the moral dimension of a recruit, which is to say, had he been in jail, or her. And so I had that responsibility to supervise the administration of the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, the AFQT, which is administered to everybody in what's called an Armed Forces Examining and Entrance Station, an AFES. Boston has one down on Summer Street. And so that was my tour. A great experience, again, for the family as well as me. But then the Army decided, we got to get you back to work. But you have to go to a training course first. We want to prepare you to work with units up to brigade size and to manage operations up to that level. And to do that, you have to go to the Command and General Staff College, which was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It was also Tornado Alley. I lived in a house which had been designed with a crawl space underneath it that you could access through a scuttle. And innumerable times, the kids and I and the wife had to jump down in there to survive tornadoes. Fortunately, a tornado never hit the house, but we had them all the time. That lasted a year. Tough course, but it prepared me well for all my future assignments. It really did. It was good.
Mm-hmm. And by this time, you were a major?
I was.
Okay.
I was a major at the Fort Eustis, and you had to be at least a major or a lieutenant colonel to go to the Commanding General Staff College, so I was eligible, and they put me in. Mm-hmm. At the end of that course, I had to go back to work, and I got the first of several field artillery assignments since I joined the branch. And I was lucky enough to draw the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. Mm-hmm. And I joined the Division Artillery. I did some odds and sods assignments working for the commander until he asked me to be the operations officer for one of the battalions, a 155 millimeter howitzer battalion. That was a new weapon to me. And so I joined a fella, his name was Don Jones. I'll never forget him. He told me, he was a lieutenant colonel, and he told me his ambition in life after he retired was to return to Killeen and be its mayor. An odd ambition. In fact, when he retired as a 3-star general and ran the disaster operations part of the American Red Cross.
Wow.
So I was a wonderful man to work for. He taught me a lot about the field artillery. And our big challenge, the year I joined that unit, the 2nd of the 19th, was to pass the first ever evaluation for nukes, for nuclear weapons. That 155 millimeter battalion was capable of firing nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense both shared the responsibility to evaluate units to make sure they were prepared to do their job safely. And so they would come out with a team of usually about 10 to 15 people and scrutinize your operations for a few days, and then write up a report, the report was critical for the commander, because if the unit failed the exam, and we understood that was not uncommon, his career was over, essentially. So we worked very hard to prepare for that, and we were the first unit at Fort Hood to take it. And I'm proud to say that we got a report that had 0 comments. People were a little amazed. And the commander of Division Artillery said, your assignment there at the 2nd on the 19th, by the way, congratulations, is over. I want you to move across the street to the 1st of the 77th Field Artillery, also a 155. And they were having their exam, their annual exam, in about a month or two. And he said, I'm going to assign you over there as the executive officer. And so I went over, and I didn't really realize why I was there, because I acted like an executive officer and took care of things that executive officers take care of. Spent a lot of time down at the motor pool. Well, I was also preparing the unit for their nuclear exam. And he came down to my office one day And he said, I don't think you understand why you're here. I said, well, I'm doing executive officer things. And he said, I don't want to see you in a motor pool anymore. I want to see you working on the nuclear. I said, I am. He said, my operations officer says you're not. And I said, well, maybe he doesn't understand how I do it. And I said, why don't you come on down tomorrow? We're having another training session, and I'll show you how we do it. And he came down, and he said, I'm impressed. He said, I'll leave you alone. You do it your way. And once again, we had an exam with no comments. We had one more 155 unit to do. But the other division at Fort Hood, 2nd Armored Division, their 2-star, called our 2-star and said, send your guy down to us because we're next with the exams. And so I prepared the 2nd Armored Division's units as well. But by that time, it was time to go. And so I did. It was a wonderful assignment, it really was. And I went to Washington. I was assigned to DESPER, which stands for the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. And actually it was a training assignment because we were responsible for all individual training in the Army, everything. So it was a pretty big division. And they gave me several assignments. One was to supervise the operation of the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And that turned out to be a great assignment. Monterey is a wonderful place. The Presidio of Monterey was a cavalry post. And they had saved a lot of money by not destroying all the cavalry facilities, including the stables. And so years and years after the cavalry had departed, you could still tell they had once been there. Monterey was where I met also a fellow that I got to know better over the years back in Washington. His name was Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta, among other things, ran the CIA, the Department of Defense. He was quite talented. I also was responsible for things like all graduate studies. So if somebody wanted to get a master's or a doctorate, they had to play by the rules that I was required to write up. And I had to supervise that program. They also gave me a few posts, mostly in the South, where basic trainees, folks coming in as recruits, would go to get their basic training. And I had several of those posts. That turned out interesting, but I won't bore you with this story.
That's okay.
I went down to Fort Jackson, and Fort Jackson had a very innovative program. It was a basic training site. I stayed at a hotel. It was down by Columbia, South Carolina. And I stayed at a hotel, and the hotel had a restaurant right next door, and I went next door to the restaurant. And they put a bowl in front of me. I asked the fellow sitting next to me at the counter, I said, can you pass me the sugar, please? And it was already a pat of butter on this porridge. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And so I sprinkled sugar on that. And the waitress came over, she saw what I had done, she said, do you know what you're eating there? You have any idea? I said, no, not in particular, doesn't matter. And no, it's grits. And she said, enjoy. and let me know how it tastes with sugar. Well, that was my introduction to the Deep South. So my assignment in Washington was, it was a level 1 assignment, which I was very happy for, which means that it was a 4-star command. But it gave me an opportunity to meet all kinds of people from all branches of the service. So that was good. I got an early promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, which put me in line to take command, which I was very thankful for. And so they sent me to Europe. And I got to Europe in 78. I had to go ahead of my family because they had me take a commander's course, and it was a language course. One of my classmates was the commander from Fort Hood, Don Jones. And so he and I went through the German course and did some traveling on the weekends, Nuremberg and Heidelberg, and the thing I think I liked about it most was my sister-in-law's younger sister was stationed there, and she and I had an opportunity to go. Her boyfriend was the Bahnhofmeister, the train station person in charge. And so they took me out to dinner one evening and introduced me to German practices in employment. He brought the waitress over and said, "Tell them how you became a waitress." Well, she said, "I went to school, first of all, and then I took an exam, and they gave me a certificate." But she was from Westphalia. So when she came down to the Heidelberg area, she was in another state and had to get entirely recertified. But I was amazed because they took employment so seriously down there and made sure that everybody was qualified to do their work. They did the same thing with car drivers. If you wanted to drive a car there, you had to go to school. And then you had to take an exam. I took that exam because I wanted a German license. And it was the kind of exam they should have in this country. It was a 2-hour exam, and it was entirely visual. They would give you traffic patterns on a road, identify which car is yours, and ask you where the problems lay in your path. And you had to use your imagination to identify the way out. And I believe that's what youngsters here show a real lack of imagination. They just don't see what the next step will be. If they do this, they don't think about that. So the Germans were very much like that. And I had seriously thought maybe of staying afterwards and retiring there in Germany. My friend Nels, who had sprung me for that quick trip to Ohio for Adam's birth, talked me out of it. And he talked me through all of the things that a German citizen has to go through. The lines, the always examining you. That may not be entirely fair, but it put balance on my thinking. We were fortunate when we were there to have assigned to us, well, to the Kaserne or post where we were located, a German teacher who was assigned by the town to be a liaison to all of the units there. Well, for some reason, he took a shine to my kids And they did some traveling, stayed at youth hostels in Switzerland and Germany and France. And also my youngest son, Mark, joined a German soccer team. And I knew he was on the team because one day he came home with the uniforms, and Marcy had a washer. And so she was in charge not of the oranges and the other snacks, but getting those uniforms clean. It was a good experience for the kids. They were at the right age to understand what they were seeing and to appreciate it. And they took every opportunity to do that. In Germany, after I got out of the commander's language course, I was assigned as the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Artillery. It was part of the 3rd Armored Division. And we were assigned in Friedberg, which is just about 10 miles north of Frankfurt. The thing that made Friedberg kind of interesting, well, first of all, we had a brigade there. So we had a brigade headquarters. We had an infantry battalion. We had 2 infantry battalions. We had an armored battalion, then we had my battalion, my artillery battalion. The thing that made it a little different is that was the home of Elvis. Yes, Elvis had an assignment as the driver of the armored battalion commander's Jeep. He lived in a town, had an apartment he had bought in a town north of where we were stationed. But they had a museum there on the 2nd floor of the battalion headquarters. And they had a lot of memorabilia of Elvis and his singing over there. I got the impression from the whole setup that he was much admired, and not just for his musical talent, but he was a good soldier. So that was interesting. After my 2 years with the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Artillery, I was assigned as kind of an interim assignment to the 5th Corps in Frankfurt. The 5th Corps was responsible for my division and a couple of other divisions. And I was assigned to the office of the commander. He was a 3-star. And they gave me a title, Secretary of the General Staff, which basically meant I worked for the Chief of Staff, yes, but I basically made life easier for all of the colonels out there who had separate divisions. They were responsible for operations and personnel and logistics, etc. So it was kind of a busy job, but it was a good one. The thing I remember most about that job was that I had an opportunity to do something. Their personal computers were making themselves felt in business. And I had seen that, and I said, we don't have any computers here. Let's set a model for the rest of the Corps. And I invited IBM, which had an office in Frankfurt, to come in, and they did. They sent in a team that stayed with me for 2 weeks, and they examined everything I did, I and the command group, and they made a recommendation. We recommend this kind of a network for you. It was a substantial investment, but my commander bought it. And he said, yeah, it's time we got beyond the typewriters. Well, naturally, the secretaries were not in favor of this at all. until I pointed out to them that with typewriters, you make a mistake or your boss makes a correction and you have to do it all over again. And this way you don't. And so they bought in. And before I left, we had the command group at least fully automated. And it was starting to spread into the other offices in the building. That's about all I remember of that assignment. Even though it was short, it was meaningful to me. And what they were doing, they were holding me up for the next class of the Army War College. And so I went into the Army War College as a lieutenant colonel. There were colonels in there as well, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We had about 400, I could be wrong on the figure, I think it was about 400 students. Half of them we never saw because they were out doing it by correspondence. The other half were with me in the building. And we had a mixture of, it was mostly Army, but we had a naval officer, we had a Army civilian from the Pentagon, and we also had a Somali, is it Somali? Somali or Ethiopian lieutenant colonel, which made for an interesting set of discussions during the year. The thing that kind of stands out about the Army War College, it's a wonderful place, is that I had an opportunity to join with two other folks to do a paper. We all had to do papers. It was kind of like a thesis. And the three of us decided we would study the proper relationship between the media and the military in conflict. The British had just finished their war down in the Falklands and were back home. And so we started out by meeting with war correspondents for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then we headed over to Europe. And we met with Peter Jennings, who was the correspondent over there at the time, and also ITN. And we went over to Whitehall and interviewed several of the military staff in Whitehall to get an update on the Falklands and how that relationship went. So it was a good assignment. The Army War College. It ended curiously. You don't normally get a chance to choose your assignment, but I had a chance to do it. They wanted to send me back to the Pentagon. I said, I've been there, I've done that. Let's talk about something else. And I said, well, we have a couple of ROTC assignments. You'd be the professor of military science. And I said, well, where? Well, one was the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, and the other was the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. And I told Billy, oh, I forgot to mention, Billy was the same fella sitting with me in the bleachers at Fort Story 20 years earlier.
Wow.
And he was on the personnel team. He was coming to the War College the next year, but he was on the personnel team bringing to us our assignments. And I said, let me sleep on this. Let's have breakfast in the morning. Is that okay? And he said, sure. And I brought the opportunity back to Marcy, and I said, you've been following me around for 20 years, and this is the first time you'll have an opportunity to choose my next assignment. which shall it be, Georgia or New Hampshire? She didn't hesitate a minute. New Hampshire. And so that set the course. I was kind of excited myself to be back in the Northeast. I have this idea about a sense of place. I'd worked all over the world, and although the locations were very interesting for the time I was there, when I got to New Hampshire, I felt more comfortable. And I think that's true for most people. Wherever they grew up, that's where they feel most comfortable and may return. In my neighborhood in New Hampshire, we had a number of corporate types. I thought I was the only one who moved so frequently, but they also did. When they got promotions or the business changed, they were on the road again. I had 21 moves in my lifetime, 14 of them with the family. One of the good things that came of this, of course, was that the kids had all these wonderful universities to choose from. They were concerned at the time that maybe their education under the Department of Defense schools wasn't up to the task, and maybe they would fall behind. Well, that turned out not to be the case at all. They were ahead of their class by quite a lot. My oldest son had already graduated and was headed down to Virginia, Washington and Lee. My middle son was senior in high school, and he was far enough ahead of his classmates that he took classes at the university instead of at the high school. Not all of them, but some. And my youngest son qualified to get into Exeter Academy, which was great for him because he was rubbing shoulders with kids from all over the country, if not the world. And that was as much an education as the learning he got there. And that helped him later on when he wound up in Intel and was working with a team of engineers who also were from all over the world. At any rate, I worked there for 3 years, and they told me I had to leave. I had to make room for someone else coming up, so there aren't very many opportunities in New England for colonels. And by that time I was a colonel. But they found one for me, and it was a gem. It was at Hanscom Field. There was a unit called the 94th Army Reserve Command. And it was responsible for all of the reserve units in New England. So it was quite a responsibility. And it just had a two-star there, running that, and I was a senior advisor. I was the active duty fella who was supposed to bring experience and understanding to situations which would come up in the command that perhaps he had not seen before and needed some advice. I did that for 4 years. And it was about that time that I decided 27 years was going to be it. And so I left the service, but not before gaining a real understanding of the sacrifice that National Guard and Reserve members make to be members of the Army. They travel great distances to get to the unit locations. They spend weekends. They spend a couple of weeks each summer. And they're a real talent too. The National Guard is mostly combat arms, but the Reserve, mostly professionals, nurses, doctors, engineers. Matter of fact, I think we had the chief pathologist at Mass General was the commander of our medical brigade. He was a 1-star. So I gained a real respect and admiration even for what they were willing to give. And as I was leaving the Army in September of 1990, several of our units were activated, and they went off to the Middle East. But they were prepared. They were ready to go. That pretty much brings me to the end of my military career. I spent a little time going in circles, but ultimately found a perfect position with the Department of Education in Washington. And I worked for a contractor that served their needs. It was a company of mostly mathematicians, and their responsibility was to administer the exam, which came to be known as the nation's report card. It's been in the news recently because scores have dropped, but we did that nationwide. Massachusetts, I'm happy to say, although I didn't live here at the time, it was always number one. Had the best educated kids in the country. There were some close competitors, but Massachusetts was always it. Mm-hmm. So that's all I have to tell you about my career.
Okay. Well, you lined up some pretty impressive medals and awards, including a Bronze Star and a Legion of Merit. Excuse me. So you moved to Natick just about a year ago, and I understand that you've joined a couple of organizations.
I have. I'm a lector at my church, mm-hmm. Which is what I was doing in Durham. And I also joined the Rotary Club here, which I gotta say is fantastic. It's a very active, very committed to the community group of guys and gals, and I'm so glad I found them. I'm not done yet.
Oh, I know you're not.
I'm still looking for one more outfit to I have the time.
Okay. Have you joined any veterans organizations?
Have not.
Okay.
I am a member of the VFW, and I'm a member of the Military Officers Association of America, MOAA. Those local chapters are both back in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. I haven't found anyone here that I want to hook up with yet, but I will.
Okay. And especially since you retired, have you received any veterans benefits such as hospitalization or other programs?
Again, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, how about what now?
Have you received, especially since your retirement, have you received any veterans benefits such as hospitalization?
Oh, yes. The retired pay is fine. And at my age, I'm drawing that plus Social Security. But the real benefit, long term, for a veteran is the medical care that they get. I'm a member of Medicare. I pay Medicare B premiums, but I cannot use Medicare. The arrangement that they've made is to shift all those dollars coming in from troops from Medicare to TRICARE. And TRICARE is a Medicare-like organization for the Air Force, Navy, and Army. Coast Guard, national organization, atmospheric administration of the U.S. Public Health Service. We have commissioned people in those two also. But yes, I've had a heart attack, and I actually have had two. I've had cancer. And for all of that, I have not paid a nickel, not a nickel. The Veterans Administration, for which I'm eligible as a combat veteran, provided me with hearing aids at no cost. My wife had cancer, and she was taken care of for over 2 years at no cost. So for me, the real benefit of post-service benefit was the medical, more even than the financial.
Given your long and meritorious service, this next question may seem a bit trite, but how important was it for you to serve in the military?
You know, funny you ask that. It makes me a little uncomfortable when people tell me thank you for your service. I know they mean well, and it was an honor. It was a privilege. You don't have to thank me for that. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was wonderful.
Okay. And Colonel, do you have anything else to say before we wrap up this interview?
No, I got to take this as neat. I'm glad you're doing this.
Thank you. So, Colonel Ric Erickson, we thank you so much for taking part in the Natick Veterans Oral History Project.
This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine.